Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. Polish President Andrzej Duda is heading to Washington for a high-stakes meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump, making him the first European leader to visit the White House since Trump's return. With Ukraine, NATO security, and U.S. Polish relations on the agenda, this visit comes just after Trump's CPAC speech, where his vision for America's global role took center stage. What can we expect from these talks, and how could they shape the future of European security? Joining us today on TVP World to discuss this is Mark Toth, a national security and foreign policy expert. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you, Benjamin. Great to be back. Good to see you.
So what does it say about Poland's role in global affairs, seeing that President Duda is actually the first European leader to meet Donald Trump in Washington?
Yeah, I think it says a lot, Benjamin. It's a great first question because clearly, in terms of the Trump administration, Poland is high on its list. You had Pete Hegseth traveling to Poland just last week, basically saying you're the model ally. They like what you're doing in terms of your GDP, defense spending at 4.7%, and there's been, discussions that Poland's going to even spend more. And so the fact that he's invited President Duda, I think, is just one more step in that direction of the Trump administration saying, look, Poland is representative of what we want to be seeing in terms of leadership in Europe and in terms of what we want to see Europe doing in terms of defending itself. So it's a good place for Poland to be in.
All right, and how receptive do you think Trump will be when it comes to Polish President Duda's objective when it comes to the discussion on Ukraine? We've seen that Trump has been viewing Ukraine less favorably than a lot of us would like to see. Do you think that perhaps the presence of the Polish president will be able to sway that even if a little bit?
Benjamin, I hope so. It's a tricky situation right now for Poland because obviously you have a divided government too. You've got President Duda, who's with the Law and Justice Party, which is in opposition, if you will, to Prime Minister Tusk's party. But really, Poland needs to come together on its national security. There just really can't be any division between the two, and certainly, at least at this point, I think one of the reasons why Trump is tapping Duda to be there now, to be in the White House, is possibly ahead of the Polish elections come May. Poland is important, Warsaw in particular, has got to make sure they don't fall into that, because I think both sides, whether you're President Duda doing it or your Prime Minister Tusk doing it, they need to be giving the same messaging to Trump that Putin is a dictator, Putin is a threat to Eastern Europe, and ultimately Trump is an existential threat to Poland itself. And you guys need to be on the same page on that, whether this election, gets in the way of that or not.
Right, and of course, this comes at the heels of Trump being, President CPAC. I was wondering, how would you interpret his message at CPAC to reflecting his approach to NATO, Ukraine, and transatlantic security? Yeah.
Benjamin, another great question, because I really think it goes to this approach of maximum pressure that Trump's trying to do. We're seeing that in a lot of areas, save one caveat. We're not seeing it yet, or at least in full force, against Putin and Russia. But elsewhere, it looks like Trump is trying to get the conservative world to rally around his vision of what he wants the global order to be, and a global order to be. And so, in terms of having Duda there, that's a sign of the conservative angle that he wants. The president of Argentina will be in Washington, D.C. later today as well. That's yet another conservative government. And then I think a lot of this discussion talk about withdrawing U.S. forces from NATO, be it the Baltic states, be it Germany and the like, I think a lot of that is messaging, too, that is aimed at tomorrow's election in Germany in terms of trying to see a favorable outcome. We've certainly been watching a favorable outcome from Trump's standpoint, not my own. But we've certainly seen a lot of Elon Musk and, by extension, Trump supporting the EFD party, which I think everyone in Europe would agree on. That's not a good idea. It really needs to be a centrist party that's strongly supportive of Ukraine, not a pro-Russian party that would be anti-Ukraine. And as their leader called for in the recent debates, she's saying no aid to Ukraine, military or economic or otherwise.
Well, as one of Ukraine's key allies, how do you think this might impact Poland's military and diplomatic commitments?
I think it's important that Poland lay out the case for why it's an important part of NATO, not just in a defensive posture standpoint. There's a lot going on in Poland at this point. If you look at it from a defensive standpoint, in addition to the Eastern Shield that you're doing, you've got key NATO installations there. You've got the, I'm not going to say these right, but in Bratslav, you've got the Aegis ashore ballistic missile system that's meant to protect Poland and Eastern and Europe from missile attacks, especially from the Middle East, potentially coming from Iran. You've got the division headquarters in Elberg, which is meant to protect and work with battle groups both in Poland and in Lithuania. And then you also have in Polszewiec the new NATO facility that's trying to work and glean lessons from the Ukraine war. It's a joint thing between NATO and Ukraine, and so a lot of transfers of technology there. So all of those things coming together, it's really important. But Poland also represents a logistics point for NATO, not just in terms of defending against any Russian aggression in the Baltic states and the like, but obviously elsewhere in terms of the U.S. being able to force project around the globe. And so it's critical that Poland explain that to Trump, push that to Trump, that you can't be withdrawing forces from us, you can't be reducing commitments to us, because it plays a key role in our defense, but also your own ability to defend U.S. interests abroad. So I think that messaging is important. I think Duda's capable of delivering it. For the past year and a half, as I've monitored Poland more closely, I've certainly seen close alignment in that regard between Duda and Tusk. So that's a good thing.
Right, and of course, not just Duda, but also UK's Keir Starmer, as well as France's Emmanuel Macron, is also going to be meeting Donald Trump, discussing the issue of Ukraine. Do you think that these leaders would also have some sort of leverage going into this discussion? And how receptive do you think the White House would be to kind of be swayed by these other foreign leaders?
Yeah, I'm not sure so much Starmer and Macron. And even from my own perspective, roughly a year and a half ago, maybe slightly longer, my writing colleague, Colonel John Sweet, who's been on TVP World as well, he and I both wrote a piece called, Old NATO versus New NATO for the Kiev Post in Ukraine. And we're basically arguing that old NATO is somewhat lost and that new NATO, as represented by Poland, is really the way forward. So Starmer and Macron are saying all the right things, but we've seen that out of Macron before in terms of troops, getting positioned in Ukraine, but they don't follow through. We've not seen enough follow through. Yes, they've delivered some mirages. Yes, they've pushed some more munitions forward. But, in terms of where I think the leadership role has to come from, in my mind, it needs to be coming from new NATO, and that's Poland. You are that anchor beyond just Ukraine, obviously, that's doing the kinetic fighting. You are that anchor, and you are the chair or the head of the EU for the next 6 months. So I really think that it's important that Poland not allow itself to be eclipsed by Starmer and Macron in terms of their own meeting that they'll have with Trump. But for you to continue to take that leadership role, because you get the threat the most. You've lived under Russian repression. You know what that's like. You broke away from that tyranny. You know what it's like to be on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. And I think a lot of us fear that if this is left unabated, this gathering storm period that we're in, there's a new Iron Curtain coming. And Poland needs to make sure it's on the right side of it in the West, not in the East.
Now, some people are seeing this meeting between the Polish president and Trump, as well as Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, as a sort of a litmus test going into the second round of discussions between the United States and Russia, to see whether or not these global leaders will be able to sway Trump's opinion at least a little bit, or give Ukraine a more favorable position compared to the first negotiation. Are you optimistic about that potentially happening?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, Benjamin. I think we just don't quite know yet what we're looking at here from Trump, whether this is just maximum pressure, if it's bombastic speech, or if this is really what we fear it might be, is just capitulation to Putin's demands in Europe. So from that standpoint, I think it's critical whether the leadership is coming from Macron and Starmer, whether it's coming from Tusk and Duda in terms of Poland. Europe needs to be united in terms of its approach. It can't allow itself to be peeled off. And then I don't really want to delve into the the internal politics of Poland too much. But there is a little bit of daylight here between Duda and Tusk, in the sense of that Duda was a little bit more accommodating of Trump's approach to Ukraine, say, giving him time, in a tweet that he made yesterday, whereas Tusk has been more forceful and forthright about the threat that Russia represents to Poland. So I think you guys need to close ranks as a country in that regard. Europe does as well, because if you don't stand together, you're going to fall individually. And I think that's the lesson we've learned time and time again in Europe, going all the way back to Czechoslovakia, and then eventually, Austria, obviously, before that, and then, eventually Poland.
How do you see these European nations evolving since Trump has maybe making these more bombastic statements towards the situation in Ukraine? Do you think that somehow it actually brought these EU leaders closer together?
I think it has. I mean, look, one could argue, and I did in a piece, one could argue that Trump is purposely trying to use this fog of war to ensure that Europe as a total, I'm not talking about Poland here, you're doing your job, you're doing your duty, but trying to get Europe as a whole to get their act together. At this point, there's many countries aren't even spending the 2% GDP target that NATO has. And he's arguing that it needs to get up to 5%. And he's basically sending a message in that regard that you need to do this. The U.S. is not just going to be the world's policeman on our own. If you want to be protected, if you want to have a defense, you're going to have to commit more to it. You just can't rely on the U.S. to do that. I do think that's a message that Europe has long needed to hear for your own best interests. Because, look, if Trump's right, and if he does withdraw U.S. support from Europe in ways that most of us don't think is possible, I don't believe that's going to happen, then you're going to be on your own. And you need to have a plan B. And you can't just have a plan B. You already have to have an actionable plan that you're putting in place to replace that. So from that standpoint, I think it's a good thing that Europe's waking up to this. The messaging, even though I disagree with the approach, I strongly disagree with the tactics that Trump is taking with our allies. I do think it's time for Europe to wake up and realize the threat that Putin represents is very real, and they need to make sure that this doesn't come marching through Belarus into Poland, the Baltic states, and the like, because we've seen what war looks like in Ukraine, and we don't want that happening in Eastern or Western Europe.
Indeed. Thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Great.
Cheers.
Always enjoy it. Thank you, Benjamin.
And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.